IVM.
So welcome to another week on IVM. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This week on Simplified in a Shorty, Naren and Shrikant simplify the phenomena of near-death experiences with interesting cases and scientific theories. On Pragati, Pawan and Hamsani are joined by economic policy expert Yazad Jal to discuss negative and positive rights. On The Scene and the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by stand-up comedian Aditi Mittal and our production controller Swati to discuss misogyny and popular culture. On Pulyabazi, Saurabh and Pranay speak to Shruti Rajgopalan about the meaning and importance of property rights in India. This week on Shunya One, we have Suchita Salwan, founder and CEO of LBP, a local recommendations platform striving to discover all things new and old. On Hustle Science, Ranveer and Tejaswan speak to their buddy, tech entrepreneur and founder of Hello Inc., Angad Nadkarni, to understand his coding craze and a lot more about his stories. And now, on to your shows.
Hi,
You're
listening to IVM
Daily.
Hi guys, hello and welcome to another episode of IVM Daily. My name is Abbas and IVM Daily is a show where IVM staffers talk about what's going on in the world and what's going on in their mind. So every once in a while, we also pay tributes to artists who have made a deep impact in our lives. Today we're sadly talking about an artist who has passed away recently. I'm going to talk about a comic book artist called Steve Ditko, who unfortunately passed away on June the 29th of this year. And I decided to do this episode because I am a huge comic book fan and I love following comic book artists and comic book history. And Steve Ditko holds a very special place in comic book history, more so because not many people know about Steve Ditko, and they should, because just to give you an example of how important Steve Ditko is, he has co-created two of the most famous comic book characters of all time. That would be Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. In fact, one can argue that Marvel Comics, as it stands today, stands on the shoulders of Steve Ditko and the other artists who created that world back in the 60s. Steve Ditko is known as someone who kind of created these characters but then disappeared from the limelight. He co-created Spider-Man and a couple of other characters, but then he went away from the limelight and he spent his years in obscurity creating comics but never really coming back to the major titles of Marvel Comics. Just to quickly recap some more amazing stuff that he did at Marvel. If you all know The Incredible Hulk, of course, we all are amazed by the Marvel movies that are made nowadays, and we are aware of these and familiar with these characters. So the character of The Incredible Hulk, actually it was Steve Ditko's idea that he'll turn green when Bruce Banner is angry. Another fine example of Steve Ditko's brilliance is if you see the armor of Iron Man, the red and yellow armor that he's known for, comes from Steve Ditko. So I think Steve Ditko is someone who has made an indelible mark on comic book history and I think history of pop culture in general. And I think that's why it was important to talk about him on this episode. I'm not going to be talking alone about Steve Ditko. I'll be joined over the phone by T. Gautam Shenoy. Let me just give you a brief intro about him. Shenoy actually is a national creative director at Saatchi and Saatchi Focus. That's his day job. But otherwise, he's an avid reader, a comic book fan, and he's actually been writing India's longest running weekly column on science fiction called New Worlds Weekly for a website called Factor Daily. I highly recommend that you check out his column and also follow him on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @thebeku, which is THEBEKKU. He's one of the most fun people to follow on Twitter if you're into science fiction and pop culture. So without further ado, let's dig into the conversation I had with him about Steve Ditko. Hi Shenoy, welcome to IVM Daily.
Thank you.
In the intro of this show, I was talking about how we recently lost Steve Ditko, who is one of the giants in the comic book world, but not many people know about Steve Ditko as much as they know some of the other Marvel writers or artists. So just first of all, how do you see Steve Ditko when you heard about his death? What went through your mind?
I mean, to say that he's Steve Ditko is a legend is a sort of understatement.
Right.
Not just his work, but his legacy and influence on some of the comics artists and writers that we love and like.
Right.
Everybody from Neil Gaiman to Alan Moore all of these people have been influenced by Steve Ditko.
Right.
And so that's perhaps how I first came across his name.
Right.
And it's a sad thing that for an artist of his stature, and for the person who gave us Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, just to name two of the more popular ones, he wasn't known too well.
Right.
But that's the fact that he was not known too well is a combination of many factors.
Okay.
Historically, for example, the artists who've been working on characters that we know
Right.
have been given the short end of the stick, so to speak. Like in the case of Batman, for example, many people, the first name that comes to mind, if at all, to many people would be Bob Kane.
Right.
Bill Finger never got his due. But in the case of Marvel, it's slightly different because those were the glory days in the early 60s, and
Right.
that's what Marvel was founded upon, and which is its lasting legacy now,
Right.
which is the trio of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko.
Right.
Now, between the three of them, they came up with almost all the best things about Marvel.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Just the characters. I mean, every major character that you can think of
Right.
came from these three people.
Right.
Now, Stan Lee at that point in time was editor-in-chief and the writer, and his name went as the creator.
Right.
And over the course of the years, he's not just a great writer, but he's also good at spotting trends and a marketing genius, if you can call.
Exactly.
So
He's a great PR person. He can sell what he made to a large audience.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing in a way, because if it wasn't for his marketing skills and his vision to spot a trend and to grab an opportunity and, not get caught up with principles and baggage and all of that, and just, tweak stories to the times, that held Marvel in good stead.
Right.
And he became the face of Marvel, and with his cameos and all, people know Stan Lee.
Right.
But just to take a step back, in those days there was something which is now known as sort of the Marvel method.
Okay. If you can quickly explain what the Marvel method is. Okay,
so the Marvel method was simple. The writer, usually what happens is that the writer writes a script or a story and then works with the artist, and it's a ongoing process.
Right.
But the Marvel method is where it's just a brief discussion.
Right.
For example, in one of the cases that I read when I was reading about Jack Kirby and all, the brief would be from Stanley was as short as one sentence.
Okay.
Let's make Doctor Doom the villain in this issue.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
And then Kirby would go and write, draw the whole story, leave space for the dialogues, create the story and everything, give it to Stanley, and Stanley would then just write the dialogue based on the story brief that he got from Kirby.
Right.
Same happened with Steve Ditko as well. Right? So, which meant that when it went out as a creator, this thing, Ditko and Kirby had to actually fight to be called co-creators.
Creators, exactly. So that's the point I was coming to, is that people still sort of know Jack Kirby. They call him Jack the King Kirby and you will find people name issues and characters that he's known for. But Steve Ditko not almost, but he became a complete recluse. I mean, I think there's just one photograph of his that you see wherever it's used, and that was clicked somewhere in the 60s.
Yes.
So why do you think, was it a conscious decision? Do you think Ditko was very deeply hurt because he didn't get the credit for Spider-Man? Why do you think he didn't own up to his creations?
He did own up to his creation, and therein lies a tale. And Steve Ditko didn't just get the credit, he didn't get the cash either.
Right.
Because in those days, Ditko, just like Kirby, were freelancers at Marvel.
Okay.
And Stanley was staff. So which meant that as per the laws of that time, the freelancers were not given rights to their creations.
Okay.
So which meant that both Kirby and Ditko lost out on a lot of royalties.
I see.
after the laws changed, the Kirby estate had filed a case against Marvel, and I think the family settled at about $30 or $50 million, depending on different reports.
Okay.
But Ditko didn't do that.
Okay.
And I think it lies in the fact that he was a fervent believer in objectivism.
Okay.
The philosophy of Ayn Rand.
I see. Okay.
So, yes, he was one of the foremost followers of it, and he actually implemented it. So if you go beyond Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and Blue Beetle, which is one of my favorites. I mean, hardly known, but that's a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
And all the others, if you look at his other characters like The Question or Mr. A, especially Mr. A, where everything is black and white, that was him trying to sort of talk about Randian philosophy and objectivism and all that.
Okay.
So if you see, he saw himself in the mold of the creator as seen by objectivism.
I see. Right.
And the reason he left was he felt exploited by Marvel and Stanley.
Right.
Yeah, and if you read Ayn Rand, that's what it talks about. Where the society exploits creators and creativity.
Right.
And in that sense, Steve Ditko was a true creator. He probably saw himself in the mold of Howard Rock and John Galt and turned his back on society.
I see. Yeah.
So, I mean, if in Atlas Shrugged, for example, people wonder who is John Galt. He just becomes a recluse and, has only limited dealings with society, if at all.
Right.
Same with Steve Ditko.
Okay. I also want to talk about how many of Ditko's characters are pretty eccentric. Like, even if you see Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, they're very different from the superhero mold that was in the 60s. As in, they don't wear capes. Doctor Strange fights his fights on a realm that's not even on Earth, and even Spider-Man's costume, his face is completely hidden. Ditko also created the character called the Creeper, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, the Creeper, much later, but yes.
Right. So where do you think that, that eccentricity, do you have anything to say about how his characters or his costumes, what he designed, were actually very different from what was the rule of the book back then?
I would not call it eccentric. I would call it very human. If you look at Peter Parker, for example, right, he's just a sickly teenage boy. Mm-hmm. He could be any of us. It could be any of us.
Right.
And it was revolutionary, if you ask me, to cover a hero's face.
Right.
With a mask. I mean,
exactly.
You had Spider-Man, muscular, steely-jawed, Batman with his jaw protruding out and all. But by obscuring the face of Spider-Man, he let people think of themselves as Spider-Man. Beneath that mask, it could be anybody.
Could be anybody, yeah, that's true.
It could be anybody. So while Kirby was sort of larger than life,
right,
Steve Ditko was more human in that sense.
I see.
Something plucked from life, the everyman.
Right.
I mean, there's a scene in, I think, Spider-Man 2 or 3 where Spider-Man is stuck in a lift with some guy and the guy says, "Hey, cool Spidey outfit." Mm-hmm. It's like that.
Right.
It could be an everyman. And as to Doctor Strange, yes, those were the days of psychedelia.
Right.
And Ditko was into, sort of mysticism and all of that. And the art sort of naturally sprung, all the hallucinatory sequences and the detailing and all of that.
Right.
So as it went, I think he wanted to push the boundaries, because Steve Ditko was somebody who kept asking what's next. I mean, in one famous letter that he wrote, he said, us artists and freelancers, we don't see what's there, we ask what is next. So he was always trying to push the boundaries, and the Creeper is as weird as it sort of gets.
Right.
That garish costume and that evil laughter, which seems to be his only superpower, so to speak.
Right. All right, and lastly, Shinoy, do you have any recommendations of that you would like to give out of Ditko books or issues that you think are a must-read if someone who doesn't know about Ditko wants to get into his art?
I would say a good starting point would be this BBC documentary by a long-term Steve Ditko fan called Jonathan Ross.
Right.
It's up on YouTube. It details out Ditko's career, his philosophies, his influence, his legacy, and all of that.
Right.
And ends up with Jonathan Ross and Neil Gaiman actually going and meeting Steve Ditko.
Right.
I mean, of course, though he did refuse to come on camera.
He's not on camera, yeah.
Yeah, the documentary is called In Search of Steve Ditko, and it's a great starting point to get into Steve Ditko. And over the course of the documentary, they mention the landmark issues and, all the characters. So that would be a great starting point. It's just about an hour long.
Okay.
Just about an hour long, but well worth the time if anybody wants to understand comics and Spider-Man and definitely Steve Ditko.
All right, Chinnoy, thank you so much for joining us. We shall definitely keep coming back to Ditko's artwork and his brilliance. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So that was my conversation with Chinnoy about the brilliance of Steve Ditko. I hope it was as insightful for you as it was for me. Please do check out the documentary that Chinnoy mentioned. I've seen it myself and it's a brilliant documentary and it's on YouTube, so check it out. And before I wrap up, once again, I would say follow Chinnoy on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @TheBekku. That's TheBekku. And do check out his column that he writes about science fiction. It's very knowledgeable and fun to read. That brings us to the end of today's episode. My name is Abbas. You can follow me on Twitter @AbbasMomin and on Instagram as AbbasMomin88. Till then, we'll see you on another episode of IVM Daily. Bye-bye.
Every week comes a show where three people come together to tell you about stuff they like. A movie, a TV show, a book, and other stuff. Tune in every Monday on the IVM podcast app to IVM Likes. Batman approves this message. Thank you, Batman.